I want to go back to this critique of mainstream media for a minute. I want to put up this diagram that comes from a book called The Uncensored War by Daniel Hallin. Daniel Hallin is a researcher. He's studied journalism. He's a university professor, and he looks at journalism, he analyzes journalism. And one of the aspects he's looked at is journalist coverage of the Vietnam War, hence the title, The Uncensored War. There's a long story about the book. It's quite an interesting book that comes to some interesting and I think very important conclusions. But for our purposes today, I just want to take out one diagram that he created that I think is very helpful in this. Remember that Lance Bennett said that the way journalists cover politics depends in part on how politicians are talking. He used the term indexing. He said Lance Bennett said when there are debates within the dominant political arena, Republicans and Democrats in this country, journalists will cover that debate. When that debate closes down, journalists cover less, right? That was this term indexing. So Bennett was saying that the amount of attention journalists give to a question tends to depend how much debate there is within the dominant political arena. Hallin's diagram is just a different way of saying the same thing. So with that in mind, with all that material from Bennett's book in mind, let's look at this very simple diagram, which has three areas. In the center of the diagram is the sphere of consensus. This is the sphere in which Hallin says there is a consensus in the dominant culture. Republicans and Democrats agree. So in the early years of the Vietnam War, Hallin is arguing that Democrats and Republicans, the dominant culture, tended to agree on the morality and the efficacy of the Vietnam War. There was a common acceptance of, endorsement of the Vietnam War. So early in the Vietnam War, he said, the debate around the war tended to happen within this sphere of consensus. And journalists operated within that sphere. They were covering a debate that went on within that sphere. As you all know, over time, the debate over the Vietnam War became more intense in the United States. And there became an anti-war movement. But even within the mainstream, even within the dominant political culture, there became a serious debate about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, Hallin says, moved from the sphere of consensus into the sphere of legitimate controversy. And reporters would cover that controversy. So in the early years of the war, reporters raised no critical questions about the Vietnam War because the war was within the sphere of consensus. Pretty much everybody who counted, the official sources, all agreed the Vietnam War was a good thing, that the U.S. should go forward in it. But when that consensus broke down, journalism started covering more critical questions because the war moved into this sphere of legitimate controversy. But Hallin says there's another sphere outside of that, which he calls the sphere of deviance. In the sphere of deviance are those people who hold ideas that are never acceptable in the dominant political culture. Those would be people outside of the politics defined by the Democratic and Republican Party. And during the Vietnam War, there were a lot of people in the sphere of deviance. The youth movement that opposed the war was in that sphere of deviance. Right? Their opposition to the war was quite different than the opposition that developed within the dominant culture. So Hallin says that journalists, mainstream corporate commercial journalists, tend to operate within the sphere of consensus. That's a very easy place to operate because everybody agrees. They operate within the sphere of legitimate controversy because they have official sources debating. That's easy to do. But he said journalists rarely venture out into the sphere of deviance. And when they do, they tend to cover it as if it is deviant. In other words, to pull this back into the conversation we started, he's saying journalists do intellectual work, but they really don't do critical intellectual work. That they aren't able to step back outside of that dominant political arena and really do the critical intellectual work necessary. So I want to connect this idea of critical intellectual work to the critique of mainstream journalism, right? To emphasize the point that to say you are committed to doing critical intellectual work is not a simple thing. It commits you to a certain relationship to power, a critical relationship to power, a relationship to power that demands of you critique. That doesn't mean that to be a critical intellectual is to condemn everyone in power, every institution through which power operates. It's to say that you are going to step back and critique all of those institutions and all of those people, no matter where that critique leads you, even if it leads you into the sphere of deviance. So I want to suggest that journalists do intellectual work, even when they don't want to admit it. All journalists do intellectual work. That doesn't mean that every day, everything a journalist does has the kind of weight that seems to attach to this notion of intellectual work. Journalists are just like everybody else. They do a certain amount of routine work that's really, quite frankly, not very intellectual or creative. I was a working journalist for a number of years. I did a whole lot of things that were routine, but that's true of any job. It's true of my job as a professor. This is a very intellectual profession I'm part of, you know, college teaching. But I'm sitting at my desk doing very routine tasks sometimes. But journalism at its core is intellectual work. The question is journalism critical intellectual work? That's the question I want you to ask yourselves. The kind of journalism you do or want to do, is it critical intellectual work? It's a way of asking yourself, what is your relationship to power? Now, for some of you, that may be a new question. It may be something you've never pondered. That's fine. In this culture, we don't tend to emphasize that question, especially in primary education. You can go from K through 12 and no one will ever ask you to reflect on that question. But I think that is the central question, especially for journalists. But even if you're not going to be a journalist, it's a central question for anybody who's a citizen, who's alive. Right. Anything about this that isn't clear, anything you want me to either explain better or you want to, you want to challenge? All right. I want to play you next a short clip that will help us get into this. Let's try that. And introduce us to John Pilger. Okay. So we're going to spend some time reading the work, if we have time later in the semester, seeing some films of John Pilger. Some of you may have already done some reading and know a bit about it, but John Pilger, Australian-born, currently living in London, a journalist now in his 60s, I believe, who's covered stories all over the world. He's been a newspaper reporter. He's written for magazines. He writes books, and he's a documentary filmmaker. John Pilger is one of those folks who's been in a lot of places and done a lot of work. But he's also a person, and he got into this through some process. So what I want to do now is just let you hear John Pilger talk a bit about himself, to kind of make John Pilger a person, not just an author. Part of that is just to remind you that John Pilger, quite an accomplished reporter, books to his credit, films to his credit. At one point he was the same place you were, okay? A young person trying to figure out where he fit in the world. There are a couple of things that are very common in the stories of journalists. When you ask journalists, how'd you become a journalist? One is a certain love for the written word. Even those of you interested in photography, video, there's something about the word, telling stories, and the power of the word that tends to be common in the experience of journalists. You know, he just liked reading newspapers. Right? Often people get into journalism. The most common thing I hear is, well, I had a high school teacher who said I was a good writer. Right? A love of writing and reading as well. And he also talks about a general orientation toward people, right? Being sort of socialized in his own family, growing up, sort of the assumption was you're on the side of the underdog. And this idea that journalism part of its mission in the world is to tell the stories of the underdog, of the people with less power. You hear this in a common phrase in journalism. It goes back decades. The role of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Comfort the afflicted, give comfort to those people who suffer in the world, and to afflict the comfortable, to do some damage to the folks with wealth and power, to critique them. And so Pilger's saying, just run-of-the-mill kid from Australia. I like to write, I like to read, and I had this idea that journalism was a way to tell the stories of ordinary people. That journalism was primarily about people. And that's another common thing you see in journalists. Journalists are people who like to talk to other people. There's a kind of curiosity about other people. Journalists are the folks who, when they see something going on, want to understand what's going on there. Why did he do that? Why did she do that? So at the core of journalism, I think, is a love of the word, a love of storytelling, and is a desire to still tell real stories about people. And the reason I emphasize that is because Pilger's book that you're reading, and all of his work, has to do with politics. But I think as you read, you'll see underneath there are always people there, real people. Right? He's not talking just about big abstract processes or institutions. He's talking about real people, which I think is the animating force of journalism.